Welcome to our 40th anniversary. Everyone is welcome except Eleanor. I stared at the handwritten sign on my parents' front door, a strange calm washing over me despite the punch to my gut. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses filtered through the windows, a celebration in full swing. Family members who had chosen sides, their side, were inside enjoying cake and champagne, while I stood outside in the cooling evening air, clutching a beautifully wrapped silver box. This wasn't how I'd imagined my Sunday evening would end when I woke up this morning. But then again, I hadn't imagined a lot of things about my family until recently. I placed the gift box carefully on the welcome mat, pushed the doorbell, and walked away without looking back. As I reached my car, I heard the front door open, followed by a moment of silence, the exact moment they must have discovered my parting gift, a detailed accounting of the $63,427 I'd given them over the past 5 years, and a note ending our relationship. My hands trembled as I started the engine, not from sadness or regret, but from something unexpected, relief. Flashback, the phone call, 3 weeks earlier, I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office at Prime Global Solutions. As head of marketing, I was preparing for a major presentation that could lead to my VP promotion. My recently paid off apartment, thriving career, and post-divorce freedom had finally given me a sense of having my life together. When Mom's name flashed on my phone, I smiled and answered with genuine warmth. Ellie, your father and I will have our 40th anniversary in 3 weeks, she announced without even saying hello. That's wonderful, Mom. How are you planning to celebrate? I twirled my pen between my fingers, half my mind still on the presentation. We've decided what you'll give us, she continued, ignoring my question. I leaned back in my office chair, a familiar weight settling in my chest. This wasn't the first time they'd decided on a gift I would provide. Last Christmas, it had been a Hawaiian vacation costing over $5,000. I justified it then, they'd helped me through college, after all. What is it this time, Mom? I asked, massaging my temple where a headache was forming. A country house, she said casually, as if asking for a box of chocolates. My pen clattered to the desk. I'm sorry. What? I think I misheard you. A country house, she repeated firmly. Your father, James, Sarah, and I talked it over. You earn good money. You're single. You paid off your apartment. You should buy us a country house where we can all relax. Your father and I, James and his wife and kids, Sarah and her family. I closed my eyes, memories flashing through my mind. My younger siblings had always been my parents' favorites. They'd gotten married young, had children immediately, and somehow that made them more worthy of my parents' approval than my career success ever had. Mom, I struggled to find words that weren't obscenities. That's a huge expense. I can't just buy a house. Well, we've already looked at some properties, she continued, steamrolling over my protest. There's a nice one about an hour outside the city. I took a deep breath. Mom, we need to talk about this in person. I'll come over tomorrow evening. There's nothing to discuss, Ellie, she said sharply. But if you want to talk, fine. Come over around 6. She hung up before I could respond. Reflection, the pattern. As I drove to my parents' suburban home the next evening, my mind drifted to childhood memories. Dad working long hours at the factory, Mom constantly reminding us how many sacrifices they made for us. My siblings got new clothes and toys, while I got secondhand items because you're so responsible, Ellie. I remembered working 3 jobs during college, struggling to make ends meet, while my parents vacationed in Florida. Yet somehow, when I started making good money after graduation, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, I owed them for all they'd done. First, it was helping with utilities. Then it was Sarah's children's preschool tuition. Then James' car repairs and his son's medical bills. I'd never connected these dots before. The pattern had been there all along, but I'd been too caught up in being the good daughter to see it. The ambush. I was surprised to find James and Sarah's cars already in the driveway. I hadn't expected an ambush. Mom opened the door with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dad sat in his recliner, nodding curtly instead of his usual bear hug. James and Sarah were on the couch, both looking at me with expectant expressions. Hi everyone, I said, trying to keep my voice light. I noticed they hadn't set a place for me at the dinner table, though they'd clearly just eaten. The message was clear. I wasn't here to be family. I was here to be an ATM. I thought we could talk about the anniversary gift, I said, settling into the armchair across from Dad. No one offered me a drink or asked about my day. Look, I started. I've been thinking about the anniversary gift. I can contribute $25,000. If James and Sarah add what they can, we could get you both a new car instead. Your Camry is getting pretty old. The silence that followed was deafening. James and Sarah exchanged glances. We can't contribute large sums, James finally said. We have families, kids, unlike you. I felt a familiar sting. My brother had grown up watching our father use money to control others. He'd never held a job for more than a year, and I'd begun to suspect his emergencies were manufactured to extract funds from me. Sarah nodded, adjusting her designer watch, a watch I knew cost at least a month of her teaching salary. We've already pitched in together for our gift. We agreed you'd get the country house. You'd use it too, Ellie, she added, as if that made it better. You could come out on weekends. It would be great. I don't have money for a country house, I said slowly, trying to stay calm. You could take out a mortgage, Mom suggested, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. With your salary, you'd qualify easily. I looked at Dad, hoping for some support, but he just stared at the floor. He'd given up his voice decades ago, choosing peace with Mom over standing up for what was right. It was a pattern I'd watched my whole life but never fully understood until now. This conversation isn't going anywhere, I said, standing up. I'll decide on my own what gift I'll give. I need to go. No one tried to stop me as I headed for the door. As I stepped outside, Mom called after me. You'll regret this, Ellie. The warning, 2 days before the anniversary, my phone rang. It was Aunt Martha, Dad's cousin. We'd always gotten along well, though we didn't talk often. Ellie, are you free for coffee this afternoon? She asked. I need to talk to you about something. How about Cafe Luna at 3? Martha's expression was grim as she sat down across from me at the cafe. I was at your parents' house yesterday, she began without preamble. I overheard something I think you should know about. My stomach tightened. What is it? Martha leaned forward. They're planning to humiliate you at the anniversary. They've moved the celebration time up by 2 hours to 4 p.m. instead of 6. They haven't told you, so you'll show up late to find the door locked. There's going to be a sign. I stared at her, my cappuccino forgotten. You can't be serious. I wish I wasn't. Your mother was quite proud of the plan. Your siblings are in on it too. Martha shook her head. I told your father I think it's despicable, but he just said you deserve it for being selfish. I've decided not to attend. I can't support this kind of behavior. Martha reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I've watched this family dynamic for years, Ellie. Your mother has always been jealous of your independence. Your father lost his voice when the factory closed. It broke something in him. And your siblings. They learned from the best how to manipulate and take. I felt tears threatening. Someone finally saw me, really saw me. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly, my mind racing. I appreciate it. What will you do? Martha asked. I don't know yet, I replied. But by the time I got home, I knew exactly what I would do. The decision, I called in sick to work the next day. I needed time to prepare my response to my family's ridiculous scheme. First, I logged into my banking app and canceled all recurring transfers to my parents. Screenshot, print. Next, I compiled a spreadsheet of every cent I'd given my family over the past 5 years. The monthly transfers, the Hawaii trip, James' car repairs, Sarah's childcare costs, the emergency medical bills I'd covered. The total shocked even me. $63,427. Screenshot, print. As I stared at the number, memories flooded back. Dad teaching me to save my allowance while James spent his immediately. Mom praising Sarah's parenting while criticizing my career choices. The countless times I'd canceled plans to help them with emergencies that always required money. I found a beautiful gift box in my closet, left over from Christmas. I lined it with tissue paper and placed the printouts inside. Then I wrote a note. Dear family, I had planned to give you $15,000 for your anniversary. Instead, I'm giving you this, a complete end to my financial support. The attached documents show I've already given you over $60,000 in recent years. That seems sufficient. From this day forward, I will no longer fund your lifestyles. In fact, I will no longer be part of your lives at all. This is my gift to myself. Goodbye, Ellie. I folded the note, placed it on top of the printouts, and closed the box. I wrapped it in elegant silver paper and tied it with a blue ribbon. It looked beautiful, the perfect Trojan horse. The aftermath. By the time I got home from delivering my gift, my phone was exploding with notifications. 6 missed calls from Mom, 4 from Dad, texts from both James and Sarah. It was just a joke. Come back. Mom. We need to talk about this, Dad. You're overreacting, James. Mom says they need money for dental work next month, Sarah. I read each message with growing disbelief. Even now, they didn't get it. Even now, my family was asking for money. I blocked all their numbers without replying, then poured myself a glass of wine and stood on my balcony watching the sunset. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of obligation lifting from my shoulders. I was done being their personal bank. I was done prioritizing their needs over my own. I was done. 6 months later, I stood on a Portuguese beach, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. Michael, my boyfriend of 4 months, stood beside me, his hand warm in mine. Penny for your thoughts? He asked, squeezing my hand gently. I was just thinking about how different everything is now, I said. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined being here. Michael nodded. He knew my story, the country house demand, the anniversary ambush, the years of financial drain. Unlike my ex-husband David, who had encouraged me to keep the peace with my family while building up his own secret credit card debt that I discovered during our divorce, Michael respected my boundaries. We'd met at a pottery class I joined after cutting ties with my family, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for between work and family demands. His first attempt at making a bowl had looked more like a deflated football, but he'd made me laugh. He was terrible at pottery, but kept trying anyway, and I admired that resilience. My therapist says I'm making good progress, I told him, watching the waves crash against the shore. Dr. Miller had helped me understand that what my family had done was financial abuse, and that I wasn't being selfish by protecting myself. You seem lighter, Michael said. Less anxious. He was right. Without the constant stress of my family's demands, I was thriving. I'd received that VP promotion, started new hobbies, and was learning who I was without the weight of toxic obligations. My family had made multiple attempts to contact me after I cut them off. Mom called from friends' phones. Dad sent letters to my office. James showed up at my pottery class. Sarah lurked outside my favorite coffee shop. But I held firm, maintaining the boundaries I'd set. According to Aunt Martha, who still called occasionally, they were all adjusting to life without my financial support. Mom had taken a part-time job at the mall, her first job in 20 years. Dad had sold his golf club membership. James had moved to a smaller apartment, and Sarah's husband had taken a second job. Do you ever think about reconnecting with them? Michael asked, watching a seagull circle overhead. I considered this carefully. Not yet. Maybe not ever on the same terms as before. If they genuinely apologized and respected my boundaries going forward, I might consider limited contact. But I won't go back to being their A-Tim. Michael smiled, wrapping an arm around my shoulders as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. That's the Ellie I know and love. Taking care of herself first. Love. He'd said it casually, but it hung in the air between us. I smiled back at him, feeling that deep happiness again. I love you too, I said softly. Looking out at the darkening ocean, I felt at peace with my decisions. I had built boundaries, protected myself from those who would drain me dry, and created space for real love and connection. My bank account was healthier, yes, but more importantly, so was my heart. The judge's gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed through the hushed courtroom. The court grants Mrs. Watson's motion in full. he announced, his weathered face showing rare emotion. Mr. Watson's passport will be confiscated pending resolution of financial matters. All identified accounts are frozen and placed under court supervision. I stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might wake me from what surely must be a dream. Across the room, Richard, my husband of 25 years, father to our 19-year-old daughter, the man who had abandoned us with nothing but a text message 3 months ago, stared at me with disbelief transforming into rage. His mother Margaret, immaculate in her designer suit that probably cost more than our monthly rent, pursed her lips until they nearly disappeared. The pristine social image she'd cultivated for decades was crumbling before her country club friends' eyes, and for the first time in our relationship, she had no cutting remark ready. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office to investigate potential criminal charges against both Mr. Watson and Mrs. Margaret Watson for identity fraud and conspiracy. Richard's hastily retained attorney looked stunned. Only yesterday, Richard had flown back to Chicago, certain he could manipulate me as he always had. Only yesterday, he called me from airport security, voice vibrating with barely controlled rage. What the hell is this, Carol? I came back to work things out. With a one-way ticket and no hotel reservation? I had countered calmly. Now as our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw the dawning realization in his. His carefully constructed escape had become his prison. I was no longer the desperate woman he had expected to find. For the first time since that devastating text message, I felt something that had been absent from my life for years. Power. The text, 3 months earlier, I was finalizing details for our publishing house 25th anniversary edition when my phone pinged. I glanced at the screen, expecting a routine message from Richard about dinner plans. Moving to Spain with Samantha. I've transferred our savings to my private account. Good luck paying rent. My hands froze mid-keystroke. My colleague Jen gave me a concerned look, but I somehow managed a reassuring smile. 25 years of marriage ended with less care than canceling a magazine subscription. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the stall door, and pressed my forehead against the cool metal partition. Who does this? Who ends a 25-year marriage, abandons their family, and steals their entire retirement savings? With a text message? Thanks for the update, I typed back, 3 hollow words masking the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I couldn't afford to break down. Not here. Not at work. Samantha was his client's marketing director, 32 to my 52. Our savings represented decades of careful planning and sacrifice, over $200,000 that was supposed to be our retirement fund, our safety net for the second half of our lives. The rent on our Chicago apartment was due in 3 days. My father's voice echoed in my memory. Always have your own money, Carol girl. Always. But I had trusted Richard. I had believed in our partnership, our shared dreams, our future. That evening at home, I called the bank, hopeful there had been some mistake. The polite representative confirmed my worst fears. Richard had indeed transferred the entire balance from our joint savings to an account under his name only. Since both our names were on the joint account, there was nothing they could do. It wasn't technically theft in the eyes of the banking system. I opened our checking account online, hoping Richard had overlooked our day-to-day funds. The balance read $1,347.12. Our rent was $3,200. That night, our daughter Emily called from college. Mom? Dad just called me. He says you two are separating. What's going on? My heart sank. Of course, he'd already reached out to her, shaping the narrative. It's complicated, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad has decided to make some changes in his life. We'll talk more when you're home for spring break next week. He said you didn't understand him anymore, she said, her voice small. That he needed to live his truth or something. It sounded rehearsed. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could catch it. I'm sure it did. The mother-in-law. As the reality of our situation sank in, my phone lit up with a call from Richard's mother, Margaret. I almost didn't answer. Margaret had never approved of me, viewing my lack of family pedigree as hopelessly beneath her son's potential. Richard was the golden child of her widowhood, the vessel into which she'd poured all her expectations after her husband's death. Carol, what have you done? She demanded without preamble. Richard says you're refusing to support his career opportunity overseas. I struggled to process her words. What? Richard just told me he's moving to Spain with Samantha. He's cleaned out our accounts. Don't lie to me, she snapped. He showed me the text messages. You're threatening to ruin his reputation at Meridian Global unless he pays you an outrageous settlement. I raised a better son than that, and he won't be bullied. As Margaret continued her tirade, a sickening realization dawned. Richard wasn't just abandoning me. He was actively creating a fictional narrative where I was the villain. And based on the conviction in his mother's voice, she believed every word. Margaret, I interrupted her, whatever Richard told you is false. I just found out today that he's leaving. He's transferred all our savings, over $200,000, to a private account. You never understood my son, she replied coldly. Always trying to hold him back with your small-town mentality. If he needed that money for his new venture, I'm sure it was justified. Besides, you have your little editing job. My little editing job had supported us during the early years of our marriage while Richard finished his MBA, a degree partially funded by my parents' modest savings. But Margaret had always conveniently forgotten that part of our history. I need to go, I said, knowing any further attempt at explanation would be futile. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about truth, justice, and the remainder of my life. Flashback. The beginning. Richard and I met 30 years ago at a literary conference in New York. I was an ambitious young editor at Horizon Books, while he was completing his MBA and working part-time in marketing for a rival publisher. He pursued me with the charismatic intensity that initially made him successful in his career. Handwritten notes, thoughtful gifts, ambitious date plans that showed he'd researched my interests. You're different from other women I've dated, he told me on our third date, as we walked along the Hudson River. You have substance. My mother might not see it right away, but she'll come around. That should have been my first warning. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony overlooking Lake Michigan. Margaret attended in a hat worth more than my wedding dress, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. The first years were good ones. We moved to Chicago for my promotion to editor, and Richard easily found a position at a financial consulting firm. We bought a modest condo, traveled occasionally, and planned for our future. When Emily was born 5 years later, we shared parenting duties while balancing our careers. Richard seemed proud of my work ethic, often introducing me as the literary genius of the family. But something shifted when Richard turned 40. His friends were making partner at their firms, buying vacation homes, sending their children to exclusive private schools. Suddenly, our comfortable life seemed insufficient to him. We need to aim higher, he'd say, looking around our condo with a critical eye that hadn't been there before. My classmate Parker just bought a second home in Aspen. What are we doing wrong? My father, a high school English teacher, had always told me that contentment was worth more than wealth. But Richard had been raised differently. Margaret's husband had left her wealthy but emotionally bereft, and she'd taught Richard that status was protection against life's uncertainties. Small expenses began appearing on our credit card without explanation. Richard started working later, citing the need to accelerate our financial growth. His mother became more involved in our lives, often making suggestions about investment opportunities that only seemed to benefit Richard's lifestyle upgrades. Emily should be attending Lakeside Prep, Margaret would say while Richard nodded. She'll never make the right connections at that public school, no matter how good its reputation. Emily, thank goodness, had her father's charm but my practicality. Grandma's living in another century, she'd whisper to me after these visits. Dad seems to forget that too sometimes. 5 years ago, we sold our condo and moved to a rental apartment after Richard convinced me we could use the equity to invest in a client startup. The investment failed within 8 months, but Richard's explanations about market volatility seemed plausible enough. When I suggested returning to full-time work after years of part-time editing, Richard insisted it wasn't necessary. Trust me, he would say. I've got everything under control. I did trust him, though doubts occasionally surfaced. Like when I discovered receipts for dinners on nights he claimed to be working late, or when he became defensive about his phone, keeping it face down and taking calls in another room. Each time, his explanations seemed just reasonable enough to quiet my suspicions. The office visit. The day after Richard's devastating text, I headed to his office, determined to confront him in person. Surely, he wouldn't simply vanish without properly dissolving our marriage. The Richard I married wasn't cruel, image conscious and occasionally selfish, but not heartless. The receptionist's expression shifted from professional welcome to discomfort when I asked for Richard. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Watson, but Richard no longer works here. He resigned last week." Last week. My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. "That's impossible. He was here Monday." She fidgeted with a pen. "I'm really not supposed to discuss personnel matters, but he submitted his resignation 2 weeks ago. Yesterday was his last day." 2 weeks. While I was planning our anniversary dinner and helping Emily with her summer internship applications, Richard had been orchestrating his escape. The receptionist avoided eye contact as I thanked her and walked numbly toward the elevator. In the parking garage, I called Richard's closest friend, Michael. "Hey, Carol," he answered cautiously. "How are you holding up?" "You knew," I said, realization dawning. "You knew he was planning to leave." Michael's hesitation confirmed it before he spoke. "He made me promise not to say anything. Said he needed a clean break." "A clean break from his family? From 25 years of marriage?" My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. "Look, I know you've been friends since college, but how could you keep this from me?" "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I told him it was wrong, but Samantha makes him feel young again. He said you'd be better off without him dragging you down." Samantha makes him feel young again. The words cut deeper than they should have. Richard's gradual withdrawal over the past year suddenly made sense. The new clothes, gym membership, the mysterious weekend conferences. "Did he tell you he emptied our bank accounts?" I asked. Michael's silence spoke volumes. "Christ, Carol, I had no idea he'd go that far." His voice dropped. "That's messed up." After ending the call, I sat in my car, the full scope of Richard's betrayal washing over me. This wasn't an impulsive decision or momentary weakness. It was a calculated escape, meticulously planned while he played the role of committed husband. I thought of all the signs I'd ignored. 3 months ago, Richard had announced he'd been offered a consulting opportunity that would require occasional international travel. "The increased income will help rebuild our retirement funds," he'd explained after the failed startup investment had depleted them. Around the same time, he'd mentioned Samantha, a marketing director at one of his client companies who was amazingly efficient at connecting him with new business opportunities. Last week, I'd found a Barcelona travel guide hidden in his desk drawer. When I asked about it, he'd laughed it off. The team might open a European office someday. Just doing some preliminary research. I'd accepted his explanation, ignoring the slight tremor in his voice and the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. That travel guide should have been my wake-up call. Instead, it became just another warning sign I chose not to see clearly until it was too late. The lawyer. 3 days after Richard's departure, I sat across from Yoko Tanaka, a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague. Her office was modest but orderly, with certificates and thank you notes framing the walls. At 55, she projected the calm confidence I desperately needed. "Let me be clear," she said after reviewing my documents. "What your husband did is reprehensible, but not entirely illegal. Since you were married, he had legal access to those joint accounts, even if he was planning to abandon you." My voice cracked despite my efforts to remain composed. "So he just gets away with it? 25 years together, and he can take everything?" "Not at all," Yoko smiled slightly. "The good news is judges don't look kindly on this kind of behavior, especially in long-term marriages. We can petition for emergency financial support and potentially freeze any remaining assets." She leaned forward. "What we need is proof that he's continuing to earn income while evading his marital responsibilities." I nodded, already gathering evidence. Screenshots of Richard's text messages, bank statements showing the massive withdrawal, emails about the Barcelona position. "Carol," Yoko said gently, I've been specializing in gray divorce for 15 years, and I've seen this pattern before. Men who leave long marriages for younger women often follow predictable behavior. They hide assets, create false narratives about being misunderstood, and attempt to rewrite the history of the marriage. That's exactly what he's doing, I said, relieved someone understood. His mother believes I'm somehow preventing him from pursuing his career. The mother-in-law, Yoko, nodded knowingly. Often a key player in these situations. We'll need to investigate her involvement too. That evening, I called my daughter at college. Mom, I'm coming home, Emily said immediately. My psych professor will understand. No, honey, stay at school. Focus on your finals, I insisted. I'm okay. You're not okay. And that's fine, she countered with typical directness. That's being a total klitsch, and you shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Besides, he's been calling me nonstop with his side of the story. I'd rather be with you. Tears welled in my eyes. At 19, my daughter was showing more maturity than her 55-year-old father. When did you get so grown up? When I wasn't looking, apparently, she said, her attempt at humor not quite masking her pain. I'll be home tomorrow night. With Emily safely on her way, I turned my attention to Richard's abandoned home office. I needed any documentation that might help my case, tax returns, employment contracts, anything that proved his income potential and ongoing obligations. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old warranties, I found a sealed envelope addressed to Margaret. Curiosity overrode my hesitation. Inside was a birthday card and a handwritten note. Mom, thanks for helping with the Barcelona apartment deposit. Samantha and I can't wait to show you our new place when you visit in May. We couldn't have made this happen without your support. Love, Richard. The date on the card was from 3 months ago, around the time Richard had first mentioned his international consulting work. Margaret hadn't just known about his plans. She had financially supported them. With shaking hands, I photographed the card and note, then continued searching. Tax returns, investment statements, our marriage certificate. I organized everything methodically. In his email drafts folder on our shared computer, I discovered an unsent message to Samantha with an attached resume listing his new position at Meridian Global Barcelona with a start date just 2 days after his text to me. The evidence showed this wasn't a sudden midlife crisis. It was a calculated exit strategy months in the making, supported by his mother and hidden from his family. For the first time since receiving Richard's message, I allowed myself to cry, not from heartbreak, but from the overwhelming realization of the deliberate deception I'd been living with. When the tears subsided, one thought remained clear. Richard had underestimated me. He had always underestimated me. Mother and daughter, Emily, arrived home the next evening, dropping her backpack in the hallway and wrapping me in a fierce hug before I could even greet her properly. Despite everything, I felt a surge of maternal pride. My daughter stood nearly as tall as me now, her dark hair cut in a practical bob that framed a face both familiar and startlingly adult. I ordered Thai food, she announced, producing a bag of takeout. And I brought reinforcements. She pulled a bottle of wine from her backpack. We're having a strategy session. I see your fake ID is still working, I observed dryly. Mom, focus on the bigger crime here, she counted, heading to the kitchen for plates. Dad stealing your retirement trumps a little underage wine purchase. We settled at the dining table, and Emily listened intently as I detailed what I discovered. Her psychology major mind worked visibly behind her eyes, processing and analyzing. Classic narcissistic behavior, she finally said. Dad's rewriting the narrative to make himself the hero of his own story. And Grandma's enabling it because it validates her worldview about you never being good enough for her precious son. When did you get so insightful about your father? I asked. Emily twirled noodles around her fork thoughtfully. Remember when I was 16 and wanted to apply for that summer journalism program instead of the business internship Grandma arranged? Dad gave me this whole speech about disappointing the family legacy and wasting opportunities. I remembered. Richard had been unusually harsh, and I'd attributed it to work stress. You stood up for me, Emily continued. You said I needed to follow my own path, not someone else's blueprint. Dad didn't speak to either of us for days afterward. She set down her fork. That's when I started seeing the pattern. How he'd undermine your decisions about me, then act like the reasonable one stepping in. How Grandma would reinforce it. I didn't realize you noticed all that, I said quietly. Mom, I'm studying psychology, she smiled sadly. Family dynamics are basically my homework. She reached for my hand. You know the worst part? He really believes he deserves this. The younger woman, the fresh start, the money. In his mind, he's earned it after years of putting up with us. Her insight stunned me. I'd been so focused on the practical impacts of Richard's betrayal that I hadn't fully processed the psychological manipulation at play. So what do we do now? Emily asked. We fight, I said simply. With Yoko's help, we document everything, follow the money, and make sure the court sees exactly what happened here. Emily nodded. And I have access to his cloud account, she added casually. He used my birthday as part of his password. Typical. I found something you should see. She opened her laptop and navigated to a folder labeled innocuously as MG Project 2023. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. A detailed timeline for Richard's departure, emails with Margaret about financial arrangements, and most disturbingly, a document titled Strategy, outlining plans to use my brief therapy sessions after my mother's death as evidence of emotional instability if I contested the divorce settlement. He was going to use Grandma's death against you, Emily said, her voice tight with anger. The fact that you saw a therapist for 3 months to process your grief. I remembered those difficult sessions, how Richard had seemed supportive, encouraging me to take all the time you need to heal. Now I understood his encouragement had been strategic, documentation for future leverage. We need to send these to Yoko immediately, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. As Emily forwarded the documents, I felt something unexpected, not just anger or betrayal, but a profound sense of clarity. The man I had dedicated 25 years to had never truly seen me. Not as a partner, not as an equal, not even as a complete person. I had been a supporting character in the Richard Watson story, useful until I wasn't. Mom, Emily said quietly, watching my face. Are you okay? No, I answered honestly. But I will be. We both will be. The final showdown. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal motions, evidence gathering, and emotional recalibration. Yoko filed for emergency financial orders based on the evidence we discovered. Richard's lawyer responded with a dismissive offer of $5,000 as full settlement of all claims. They're testing your desperation, Yoko advised. Don't engage. That night, I received a direct message from Richard. Take the settlement, Carol. You won't get more, and fighting will just drain what little I've offered. Be reasonable for once. His condescension ignited a quiet fury. I didn't respond, but saved the message as further evidence of his attitude. 2 days later, we secured an emergency hearing date. That same afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Samantha's former colleague, Jennifer, who had discovered my contact information. I thought you should know what they were planning, Jennifer said hesitantly. Samantha's been talking about this for months, how they were going to start fresh in Spain without any baggage. She even bragged about how Richard was setting aside money where you couldn't touch it. My momentary optimism crumbled as Jennifer described conversations she'd overheard about offshore accounts and establishing residency in Spain specifically to complicate legal proceedings. They have a whole plan to make fighting them so expensive and difficult that you'll eventually give up, Jennifer concluded. I'm sorry. I just thought you deserved to know what you're up against. The morning of our emergency hearing, I woke to another text from Richard. I hear you're dragging Mom into this. Bad move, Carol. Drop this now, or I'll make sure you regret it. His threat strengthened my resolve. In the courthouse, Yoko and I waited outside the assigned courtroom, reviewing our presentation one final time. The doors opened, and Richard's lawyer emerged, a polished man in an expensive suit who exuded confidence. Mrs. Watson, he nodded curtly. Mr. Hoffman, representing Richard Watson. Before I could respond, an unexpected figure appeared behind him. Margaret, immaculately dressed and wearing the same disapproving expression she directed at me for years. You should be ashamed, she hissed, ignoring Yoko's warning hand on my arm. Trying to extort my son when you're the one who drove him away. Mrs. Watson, Yoko interjected smoothly. Since you're here, I should inform you that we'll be calling you as a witness regarding your financial support of your son's abandonment of his family. Margaret's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. I have no idea what you're talking about. The hearing proceeded with clinical efficiency. The judge listened to both arguments, reviewed our evidence of Richard's withdrawal of funds and new employment, and granted our emergency motions. Richard would be required to provide immediate financial support and return a portion of the marital assets while the case proceeded. It felt like a significant victory, but Margaret's unexpected appearance troubled me. Why had she flown to Chicago for a routine emergency hearing? That question was answered the next day when I received a call from an unknown international number. Is this Carol Watson? A woman's accented voice inquired. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Lucia Vega, HR Director at Meridian Global Barcelona. I'm calling about your husband, Richard Watson. My heart raced. Yes, we received your email about his employment situation. I wanted to inform you that Mr. Watson no longer works for Meridian Global. He was terminated yesterday. I frowned in confusion. I didn't send any email. There was a pause. Someone using your name sent documentation showing Mr. Watson was involved in a financial dispute and had pending legal issues in the United States. Company policy requires disclosure of such matters during the hiring process. The realization hit me. Margaret. She had impersonated me to sabotage Richard's employment, ensuring he couldn't comply with the court's support order. It was a calculated move to undermine the judge's ruling and validate Richard's claim that he couldn't afford to support me. Ms. Vega, I did not send that email. Could you forward it to me? Minutes later, I was staring at a message allegedly from me, filled with distorted half-truths about Richard's situation and threatening the company with legal action if they continued employing him. The email included copies of our personal documents, some of which I'd only recently gathered for Yoko. My apartment had been untouched, which meant only one person could have accessed those documents. Margaret, during her brief visit to the building lobby the day before the hearing, when she claimed to be dropping off family photos for Emily. I immediately called Yoko, who validated my suspicions. This is identity fraud and interference with a court order. We need to document everything and file additional motions. While we were developing this new strategy, my phone rang again. Richard, calling directly for the first time since his departure. You vindictive bitch, he snarled without preamble. You got me fired after everything I offered you. It wasn't me, Richard. It was your mother. His momentary silence confirmed he recognized the possibility. That's absurd. Why would she do that? To make you look unable to pay support, to undermine the court order, to turn you further against me. You're lying, he said. But uncertainty had crept into his voice. Mom would never sabotage my career. Look at the email that was sent. I'm forwarding it to you now. Those documents were in our apartment until your mother visited. The line went silent for several seconds. I'll call you back, he finally said. 20 minutes later, my phone pinged with an email from Richard containing a bombshell. A series of text messages between him and Margaret revealing a disturbing truth. This wasn't just about Richard leaving. It was about Margaret's lifelong campaign to control her son and eliminate perceived threats to that control. Once you're established in Spain, Margaret had written 3 months earlier, we can discuss your future without Carol's constant undermining. Her little breakdown after her mother died shows how unstable she really is. My grief after losing my mother, which I'd worked through with therapy and what I thought was Richard's support, had been weaponized against me all along. The revelation of Margaret and Richard's long-term dynamic transformed my understanding of our marriage. This wasn't merely about a midlife crisis or a younger woman. It was about a lifelong pattern of emotional manipulation that I'd been drawn into 25 years ago. Yoko immediately filed additional motions documenting Margaret's identity fraud and interference with court orders. We also reported the identity theft to the police, creating an official record of Margaret's illegal actions. We've strengthened our position considerably, Yoko assured me. But Richard still has the advantage of physical distance and most of your marital assets. I knew we needed something more, undeniable evidence that would convince a judge to freeze all of Richard's assets and potentially compel his return to the United States. The text messages proved the conspiracy, but not the location of our missing savings. In a moment of inspiration, I contacted Michael again. I need your help, I said without preamble. Not for me, but for the truth. Michael's guilt over his silent complicity in Richard's plans made him receptive. What do you need? Information. Richard must have told you more about his financial arrangements, where he was moving the money, how he planned to support himself in Spain. There was a long pause. He mentioned an account in the Cayman Islands. Said his mom helped him set it up years ago for tax purposes. I didn't think much of it at the time. Did he mention the bank name? Any details at all? First Caribbean International, I think. Look, Carol, I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I never thought he'd go this far. This new information gave us a starting point, but we needed details. Account numbers, transfer records, anything that would concretely tie Richard to hidden assets. Emily's access to Richard's cloud storage proved invaluable again. Working together, we found a folder of financial documents that Richard had failed to properly secure. Screenshots of transfer confirmations, correspondence with Margaret about the offshore account, even a document titled Asset Protection Strategy. I immediately forwarded everything to Yoko, who called back within the hour, her voice tense with controlled excitement. This is exactly what we needed. I'm filing for emergency orders freezing the Cayman account and requesting international enforcement. 2 days later, we received our first major victory. The judge granted our motion to freeze Richard's offshore account pending further investigation. Richard's lawyer immediately filed a counter motion accusing me of illegal access to electronic information, which momentarily threatened our progress. Then came an unexpected complication. Samantha called me directly. Carol, we need to talk, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. Richard's falling apart here. That's not my concern anymore. Please, she insisted. He's talking about flying back to Chicago to fix things with you directly. I'm worried about what he might do. A chill ran through me. Richard had never been physically violent, but his current desperation made him unpredictable. Why are you telling me this, Samantha? Because this isn't what I signed up for. He promised a fresh start, not a man obsessing over his ex-wife and hiding money from me too. Her words caught me off guard. He has another account I just found out about. After the judge froze the Cayman account, he told me we'd be fine because he has backup funds even his mother doesn't know about. This was potentially crucial information, but I sensed Samantha wasn't sharing out of pure altruism. What do you want, Samantha? Protection, she said simply. When Richard finds out I've talked to you, he'll turn on me too. I need assurance that I won't face legal consequences for my role in this. After consulting with Yoko, we crafted a proposal, immunity for Samantha in exchange for complete documentation of all accounts and a sworn statement about Richard and Margaret's conspiracy. Samantha agreed immediately, sending bank statements showing a second account in Liechtenstein containing the bulk of our marital assets, over $180,000. With this final piece of evidence, we secured an emergency restraining order just hours before Richard's scheduled arrival in Chicago. When his plane landed, airport security would be waiting. Epilogue. 6 months later, 6 months after that fateful courtroom victory, Emily and I sat on the small balcony of my new condo, watching the spring sunset paint Chicago's skyline. The court-ordered forensic accounting had uncovered not just our marital assets, but additional funds Margaret had hidden for tax purposes. Both faced civil penalties, with Margaret also charged with identity fraud for impersonating me to Meridian Global. Richard's attempts to rebuild his life in Chicago after the court confiscated his passport had floundered. His industry colleagues had gradually distanced themselves as the public court records detailed his financial dishonesty and abandonment. Samantha had returned to her marketing career, her immunity agreement having served its purpose for both of us. The divorce finalized with terms that acknowledged my 25 years of partnership, complete restoration of our marital assets plus legal fees and substantial financial support indexed to Richard's future earnings. Most satisfying was watching Margaret's carefully constructed social facade crumble when her country club friends discovered she had committed identity fraud to sabotage her own son's employment. The woman who had judged me for years now faced judgment from her peers. Mom, did you ever think we'd end up here? Emily asked, sipping her tea as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline. She was home for spring break, her sophomore year of college nearly complete. Here specifically? No, I admitted, but somewhere better than where we were. I always believed that was possible. Emily smiled. You know what's weird? I'm almost grateful this happened. Not the way it happened, she clarified quickly, but that it did. You're different now. Different how? I asked. Stronger. More yourself. She gestured toward my laptop, where the manuscript of my first novel sat open. You're doing things you always talked about but never had time for. You're not apologizing for taking up space anymore. Her observation struck me with its accuracy. Somewhere in the process of fighting for what was rightfully mine, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been gradually compromised during my marriage. My new position as senior editor at the publishing house came with the confidence I'd earned through years of experience, no longer diminished by Richard's subtle undermining. What about you? I asked my daughter. How are you really doing with all of this? Emily considered the question seriously, a trait I'd always admired in her. I'm sad about who Dad turned out to be, but I'm not sad about our life now. She reached for my hand. My psych professor says that sometimes we need to lose the story we thought we were living to find the one we're meant to write. I smiled at her wisdom. When did you get so smart? Must be genetic. She grinned, then grew serious again. Dad called last week. He wants to meet for coffee when I'm back in the fall. How do you feel about that? I haven't decided yet, she said honestly. Part of me wants to understand why he did what he did. Another part thinks there's no explanation that would ever make sense. I nodded, understanding her ambivalence perfectly. Whatever you decide, I support you. We sat in comfortable silence as the city lights began to twinkle around us. In the distance, Lake Michigan stretched dark and vast, the same lake where Richard and I had exchanged vows 25 years ago. I felt a momentary pang, not of regret but of acknowledgement of the years invested, the memories created, the lessons learned. You know, when I got that text from your father, I said quietly, he ended it with good luck paying rent. Like that was the worst thing he could imagine happening to me, being without his financial support. Emily snorted. Classic Dad. But here's the thing, I continued. He never understood that I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was afraid of living inauthentically. And now I don't have to. My phone pinged with a message from my publisher. The editing team loved my manuscript and wanted to fast-track it for next spring's catalog. Another small victory in a series of personal reclamations. At 52, I was rediscovering what it meant to live on my own terms, without apology or permission. Richard's parting text, good luck paying rent, had been intended as a devastating final blow. Instead, it became the first line of a story about finding strength I never knew I possessed. We're going lean, Jason Morrison announced, not even sitting down in what was once Robert's office. We don't keep dead weight around here. You're done. I stared at the 32-year-old who had been CEO for precisely 6 hours and 43 minutes. The glossy Stanford Business School diploma hanging behind his desk still had the price tag dangling from the frame. 20 years of dedication reduced to a 10-second dismissal. My hands trembled slightly, but I clasped them tightly in my lap. 54 years of life had taught me one thing. Never let them see you break. I see, I replied, my voice steadied despite the earthquake rippling through my chest. May I ask why? Jason's lips curled into what I assumed was his version of a businessman's smile. My father might have needed someone to hold his hand through every contract, but I have a different vision for this company. We're modernizing. Modernizing. The euphemism of the decade for replacing experienced workers with younger, cheaper versions. I nodded slowly, thinking of the personnel files I'd been reviewing before his assistant summoned me. Files that contained, ironically, my own carefully negotiated employment agreement. I'll need this in writing, of course, I said, rising from the visitor's chair. HR will have something for you to sign on the way out, Jason said dismissively, already turning to his computer. Security will escort you to clear your desk. Standard procedure. Standard procedure. As if there was anything standard about discarding someone who had helped build this company for 2 decades. Of course. Thank you for the opportunity to work here. Confusion flickered across Jason's face at my composure, but he quickly masked it with another practiced smile. Best of luck, Sarah. As I walked to the elevator, past the shocked faces of my team, I felt 20 pairs of eyes on my back. I didn't stop to explain. There would be time for goodbyes later. Right now, I needed to focus on the document folded in my bag, the one Jason clearly hadn't bothered to read. In the car, breaking point. In my car, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, tears blurring my vision. 20 years. 20 goddamn years of my life, of missed birthdays and school plays, of late nights and early mornings, of solving impossible problems and saving millions for the company, all erased by a boy who'd never known a day of hardship in his privileged life. I fumbled for my phone, dialing the one person who would understand. After 3 rings, she picked up. Mom? Aren't you supposed to be at work? My daughter's voice, clear and concerned, brought fresh tears to my eyes. Liz, honey. My voice cracked. I just got fired. What? By Robert? That's impossible. Not Robert. His son, Jason. Robert retired last week, remember? There was a pause. Oh, Mom. I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I wiped my eyes, looking at myself in the rearview mirror. Crow's feet, gray strands in my brown hair, the slight sag beneath my chin, physical evidence of the very experience Jason Morrison had just deemed obsolete. I will be, I said, my resolve returning. Remember that contract Robert and I negotiated 3 years ago? The one with the golden parachute clause? The one that pays out if you're fired without cause? Liz asked. She'd inherited my memory for details. Exactly. I don't think our new CEO bothered to read my file before deciding my fate. Liz laughed, a sound that always lifted my spirits. Oh, Mom. He has no idea who he's dealing with, does he? No, I smiled, opening my bag to pull out the contract. He really doesn't. Flashback, 9 years ago. My introduction to Morrison Materials happened 9 years ago when I was 45 and determined to rebuild my life. After my second divorce left me emotionally drained but financially responsible for putting Liz through college, I needed stability. With my law degree and focus on contract law, I applied to every major company in New England that might need someone to review their agreements. Robert Morrison had personally interviewed me, a rarity for the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing company. He was in his late 50s then, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had seen both success and hardship. Your attention to detail is impressive, he'd said, reviewing my sample contract revisions. Most lawyers just rubber stamp whatever we put in front of them. I need someone who will tell me when I'm about to step in it. Well, I've never been accused of holding back my opinions, I replied, earning a genuine laugh from him. Sarah Bennett, he'd said, extending his hand. I think you're exactly what this company needs. I was hired the next day. Over the years, I became more than a contract specialist. I was the one Robert called when a supplier threatened to pull out, when a major client was unhappy, when the company needed to navigate complex regulatory changes. I reared agreements that saved millions, spotted loopholes that would have cost the company dearly, and eventually earned my place at Robert's right hand. What I didn't know then was how much Robert's faith in me would reshape my life, or how quickly his son would try to unravel it all. At home, strategy planning, that evening, I spread my employment agreement across my dining room table, alongside the termination notice HR had hastily printed for me. My name was misspelled, Sarah Bennett instead of Bennett, a small but telling oversight that reflected the carelessness of my dismissal. My fingers traced the golden parachute clause that Robert had insisted on 3 years ago when Williamson Supplies tried to poach me with an offer that made my eyes water. Robert counted with not just matching pay, but an employment agreement that reflected how much he valued my contributions, a full year's severance, equity options, and most importantly, a trigger clause that paid out $250,000 if I was ever terminated without cause. Your family now, Sarah, Robert had told me as we signed the agreement. This company wouldn't be what it is without you. I believed him. And for 3 more years, I gave Morrison Materials everything I had. I'd watch Liz graduate medical school via FaceTime because I was closing a deal in Chicago. I'd postponed vacations, worked weekends, and prioritized the company's needs above my own comfort countless times. My phone buzzed with a text from Carol, my assistant at Morrison. Are you okay? Everyone is in shock. Robert is flying back tomorrow. I hadn't expected that. Robert was supposed to be on a month-long cruise celebrating his retirement. For him to cut that short meant Jason had likely shared the news of my departure. I'm fine, I replied, just surprised at the timing. Jason called an all-hands meeting to announce a new direction for the company. Said he's bringing in his own team from Stanford. That explained it. Jason wasn't just firing me. He was dismantling everything his father had built piece by piece. I thought of Robert, who had started the company from nothing, who had worked 16-hour days for decades, who had created jobs for hundreds of people, and now his son was tearing it down in less than a week. I set my phone aside and walked to the window. The April evening was cool, cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom in my small garden. At 54, I had thought my career path was set. Now I was facing an unexpected crossroads. With a renewed sense of purpose, I picked up my phone again and dialed a familiar number. Joseph Williams, answered the voice on the other end. Joseph, it's Sarah Bennett. Sarah. To what do I owe the pleasure? How are things at Morrison? I took a deep breath. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I was terminated today. There was a pause. You're kidding. Robert fired you? Not Robert. Jason. Robert retired last week. Another pause, longer this time. I see. Well, his loss is someone else's gain. As a matter of fact. Flashback, watching Jason. In the weeks before Robert's last day, I had noticed Jason watching me during meetings, his expression calculating. He was handsome in that polished way of privileged young men who've never had to doubt themselves. I knew his type. I'd been married to one in my 20s. All confidence on the surface, crushing insecurity underneath. When I presented the quarterly compliance report, highlighting potential risks the company needed to address, he had dismissed my concerns as excessive caution that was holding the company back. Robert had defended my thoroughness, but I saw the writing on the wall. Jason viewed me as his father's right hand, not his own. I understood why. I had watched him grow up, from a defiant teenager who resented his father's long hours at the office to a young man desperate to prove himself. Robert had confided in me once, after Jason left for Stanford, about his worries for his only son. He's brilliant, Sarah, but he's never known struggle, Robert had said, gazing at a family photo on his desk. His mother spoiled him after we lost her sister in that accident. I was too busy building the company to counterbalance it. And now, he trailed off, but I understood the unspoken concern. Jason had book smarts but lacked the wisdom that comes from overcoming adversity. I had started updating my resume that night. What I hadn't expected was the abruptness of my dismissal. No warning, no transition period, not even a pretense of restructuring. Just, you're done, from a man who had been handed everything his father had built. Morrison Materials. The return. I arrived at Morrison Materials just after 9 the next morning, not as an employee, but as someone with unfinished business. The receptionist did a double take when I walked through the glass doors, wearing the same professional attire I'd worn every day for 9 years. Ms. Bennett, I thought. I mean, we heard. Is Robert in? I asked calmly. Her eyes widened. Yes, he came in early. He's with Jason in the conference room, but I don't think. Thank you, Jennifer. I smiled and headed toward the elevator, my heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. As the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, I could hear the shouting before I even stepped out. Robert's voice, normally so controlled, echoed down the hallway. Did you even read her agreement before firing her? I approached the conference room slowly, noting the small crowd of executives and assistants who had gathered at a safe distance, pretending to be busy while straining to hear the confrontation. Carol spotted me first, her eyes growing wide. She hurried over. Sarah, what are you doing here? I have a meeting, I said simply. With who? Jason's in there getting the lecture of a lifetime from his father. Apparently, Robert cut his cruise short when he heard what happened. I nodded, unsurprised. Robert had always been hands-on, and despite his official retirement, He wasn't the type to sail into the sunset while his company changed course. The conference room door flew open, and Jason stormed out, his face flushed with anger, which quickly drained to shock when he saw me standing there. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Before I could answer, Robert appeared behind him. Unlike his son, Robert looked pleased to see me, though the dark circles under his eyes revealed his exhaustion. "Sarah, perfect timing. Please join us." He gestured for me to enter the conference room, then turned to the gathered audience. "The rest of you, back to work." Inside, the long conference table was covered with papers, including, I noticed, several copies of my employment agreement. Beside them sat Patricia Clark, the head of HR, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Ms. Clark was just explaining to Jason why your termination might be problematic," Robert said, closing the door behind us. Patricia cleared her throat. "As I was saying, the agreement Ms. Bennett signed 3 years ago included several protections, including—" "I know what it includes," I interjected smoothly. "1 year of severance at my current salary, immediate vesting of all outstanding stock options, a non-compete waiver, and a clause granting me full rights to consult for any competitor I choose." I paused, making sure Jason was looking at me before continuing. "And a $250,000 early termination payout if fired without cause." Jason's face cycled through several emotions. Disbelief, then anger, then something close to panic. "That can't be right," he said, grabbing one of the copies and flipping through it frantically. "Page 7, paragraph 4, I offered helpfully. "The negotiation." Robert turned to me, his expression softening. "Sarah, I want to apologize for my son's actions. Your termination is rescinded effective immediately. Your position, your office, everything will be restored." I had anticipated this, of course. Robert was nothing if not loyal to those who had served him well. But loyalty wasn't what had brought me back to Morrison Materials that morning. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I've already accepted a position elsewhere." The silence that followed my announcement was broken only by the sound of Jason dropping the agreement onto the table. "Where?" Robert asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer. "Williamson Supplies," I replied. "I start next Monday as their Director of Contract Management and Compliance." Jason let out a sharp laugh. "You can't. Your non-compete was waived upon termination without cause," I reminded him. Page 9, paragraph 2. Robert sank into a chair, looking suddenly older than his 68 years. "You've been planning this." "No," I said honestly. "But when the opportunity presented itself, I would have been foolish not to take it." "They'll want our client list, our pricing structures," Jason began, panic edging into his voice. I raised an eyebrow. "All things I'm legally entitled to use, given how my employment was terminated." I turned to Robert. "Though I should mention that my agreement with Williamson specifically excludes using proprietary information from Morrison. Joseph Williams may be a competitor, but he's not without ethics." Robert nodded, unsurprised. He and Joseph had known each other for decades, rivals who respected each other's boundaries. "What do you want, Sarah?" Robert asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. "Excuse me? You could have simply taken the payout and started your new job. You didn't need to come back here. So what do you want?" I considered his question carefully. What did I want? Revenge? Satisfaction? An apology from the arrogant young man who had dismissed 20 years of dedicated service in less than a minute? As I looked at Robert's face, lined with decades of stress and decision-making, I suddenly remembered my own father. He'd worked at the same factory for 30 years, only to be let go when a new manager decided to cut costs. He never recovered from that betrayal, and the memory of his broken spirit had fueled my determination to succeed. "I want what I'm owed," I said finally, "and I want to make sure the people who still work here are treated fairly." Jason scoffed. "This is a business, not a charity. Your father built this business by valuing his employees," I countered. "That's why Morrison Materials has one of the lowest turnover rates in the industry. It's why your suppliers are loyal even when competitors offer lower prices. It's why clients trust Morrison to deliver even when timelines are tight." Robert was watching me with a thoughtful expression. You care about this company. I gave 20 years of my life to it, I acknowledged. I'd prefer not to see that work undone in 20 days. The proposal. I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it on the table. A consulting arrangement. I'll help with the transition of my duties, advise on pending contracts, and provide insights on key client relationships. In return, I received the compensation outlined in my termination clause, plus a consulting fee. Robert picked up the folder and skimmed its contents, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You've thought this through. It's what you hired me to do, I reminded him. He handed the folder to Jason. Read it carefully this time. Jason accepted the folder reluctantly, his expression sullen as he read. His eyes widened slightly at certain points, and I knew he was recognizing the strategic value of what I was offering, despite his wounded pride. This would give her access to our operations, even while she works for Williamson, he objected. With strict confidentiality provisions, I pointed out, and a clear delineation of what constitutes proprietary information. Joseph is aware of this arrangement and has approved it. Robert looked impressed. You've already cleared this with Williamson? It was a condition of my acceptance, I confirmed. They get my expertise without the ethical complications. Jason tossed the folder back onto the table. This is blackmail. No, Robert corrected him, his voice sharp. This is negotiation, something you would understand if you had taken the time to learn the business instead of assuming you could run it based on theory alone. The tension between father and son was palpable, years of unspoken expectations and resentment suddenly laid bare in the sterile conference room. Patricia excused herself quietly, leaving the three of us alone with the aftermath of Jason's hasty decision. I'll need time to review this proposal, Robert said, closing the folder. Of course, I replied, but I should mention that my offer to help with the transition expires at the end of the day. After that, the only communication will be through lawyers regarding my termination package. Jason's face reddened. You're giving us an ultimatum. I'm being practical, I corrected him. My new position requires my full attention, and Williamson has already been generous in allowing this arrangement. I won't ask them to wait indefinitely. Robert studied my face, searching for something, resentment, perhaps, or vindictiveness. Finding neither, he nodded slowly. You were always fair, Sarah, even when you had every reason not to be. He turned to his son. Jason, step outside. I need a moment with Sarah. A private moment. Jason looked as though he wanted to object, but something in his father's expression stopped him. With a final glare in my direction, he left the conference room, closing the door with controlled force behind him. He has potential, Robert said once we were alone, but he lacks patience and humility. He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. I thought giving him the reins would force him to grow up. I see now that was a mistake. It's not my place to comment on your decisions regarding Jason, I said carefully. Robert smiled ruefully. That's diplomatic of you, but we both know this isn't how I wanted things to end between Morrison Materials and Sarah Bennett. I felt a twinge of nostalgia for the years I'd spent at the company, the challenges we'd overcome, the victories we'd celebrated. For a moment, I was transported back to all the late nights working alongside Robert, solving impossible problems together, the mutual respect that had defined our professional relationship. Business is business, I said, echoing a phrase Robert himself had often used. Indeed. He picked up my consulting proposal again. I'll sign this, and I'll make sure Jason understands the terms and the consequences of violating them. He paused, studying me with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness despite his age. But before you go, I want to ask you something off the record. I nodded, curious. What would it take to bring you back? Not now, but eventually, once things are settled? The question took me by surprise. I thought of my daughter Liz, how proud she had been when I told her about the offer from Williamson. You deserve a place that values you, Mom, she'd said. I thought of all the times I'd sacrificed for Morrison, the family events missed, the vacations postponed. Honestly, I don't know, I replied. Williamson is offering opportunities I hadn't considered before, and after what happened, trust is difficult to rebuild. But not impossible, Robert acknowledged. Morrison would need to change the culture, the leadership approach. Your son would need to demonstrate that he values the people who make this company work, not just the bottom line. That's a tall order. You asked what it would take, I reminded him. Robert laughed, a genuine sound that momentarily erased the tension of the morning. So I did. He extended his hand. No matter what happens next, it's been an honor working with you, Sarah. I shook his hand, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion. Likewise, Robert. As I turned to leave, Robert called after me. Sarah, one more thing. I paused at the door. Jason will hate this, but I'm going to insist he attend your transition meetings personally. Consider it part of his education. I couldn't help but smile. That seems appropriate. New beginnings. The following Monday, I walked into Williamson Supplies' gleaming headquarters as their new director of contract management and compliance. My office overlooked downtown, a far cry from the windowless space I'd occupied at Morrison. Joseph Williams himself showed me around, introducing me to the team and outlining my responsibilities. I've been trying to get you over here for years, he said as we settled into his office for a coffee, though I have to admit the circumstances are surprising. Life is full of unexpected turns, I replied diplomatically. Joseph chuckled. That's one way of putting it. The consulting arrangement with Morrison. That was clever. Gets us your expertise while avoiding messy legal battles. It was the right thing to do, I said. Robert built that company from nothing. I respect that, even if I disagree with how his son is running things. Speaking of which, Joseph leaned forward, his expression turning serious. The first transition meeting is tomorrow. Are you prepared for that? I nodded. I've compiled detailed handover notes for all my active projects. The goal is to ensure a smooth transition, not to create problems. And Jason? How do you think he'll handle it? I thought of the sullen young man who had dismissed me so casually, who was now forced to learn from the very person he had deemed obsolete. Poorly at first, but Robert will keep him in line. Joseph seemed satisfied with my answer. Good. The last thing we need is unnecessary drama. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner in my apartment, my phone rang with a FaceTime call from Liz. Mom, how was your first day at the new job? Her face filled the screen, her smile so like mine before time had carved its lines around my mouth. Wonderful, I said, realizing I meant it. My office has an actual window, can you believe it? After 20 years at Morrison? That's the least they could do. She laughed. I'm so proud of you, Mom. Most people would have just taken the payout and licked their wounds. I thought of my father again, how deflated he'd become after losing his job, how he'd never quite recovered his sense of self-worth. I'm not most people, I said. No, you're not, Liz agreed. You're Sarah Bennett, and you taught me that when someone underestimates you, that's their mistake to regret. As we chatted about her work at the hospital and her upcoming visit, I felt a profound gratitude for this brilliant, compassionate woman I'd raised largely on my own. Whatever mistakes I'd made in my marriages, whatever sacrifices my career had demanded, Liz was proof that I'd done something right. The final meeting over the next 2 months, I divided my time between establishing myself at Williamson and fulfilling my consulting obligations to Morrison. The transition meetings became less tense as Jason gradually realized the value of what I was sharing. He began asking questions, sometimes even taking notes, a far cry from the dismissive attitude he displayed on his first day as CEO. During our final scheduled meeting, Jason approached me as I was gathering my materials. I underestimated you, he said, his tone measured, and I misjudged the situation. I looked up, surprised by what sounded like an apology. We all make mistakes, especially when we're new to a role. Jason frowned slightly. That's what my father says, but it's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It's not, but acknowledging the mistake is the first step toward not repeating it. He seemed to consider this. The consulting agreement expires next week? Yes. Would you consider extending it? On a more limited basis, of course. Just for the most complex contracts? I hadn't expected this request. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, given my position at Williamson. I've already discussed it with Joseph Williams, Jason admitted. He's open to it, provided there are clear boundaries. This was news to me. I made a mental note to speak with Joseph as soon as I returned to my office. Why me? There are other consultants with contract expertise. Jason's expression was reluctant but honest. Because you know our business, and because I need to prove to my father that I can learn from my mistakes. I studied him, looking for signs of the arrogance that had characterized our previous interactions. Instead, I saw something new, a humility that hadn't been there before. I thought of my own son-in-law, how Liz had described his growth from an arrogant medical student to a thoughtful doctor who respected his nurse's input. I'll think about it, I said finally. That's all I can promise. Jason nodded, accepting this partial victory. That's fair. As I left Morrison Materials for what might be the last time, I reflected on how differently things had turned out from what I had initially expected. I had walked away with not just financial compensation, but with my professional reputation enhanced and, surprisingly, a measure of respect from the very person who had dismissed me. At 54, I had feared my career might be ending. Instead, it had taken an unexpected turn that opened new opportunities I wouldn't have considered otherwise. The agreement that Jason had failed to read had changed the course of my career in ways I never could have anticipated. Epilogue. 6 months later, the maple outside my apartment window had turned a brilliant red, signaling the arrival of New England autumn. 6 months had passed since my abrupt departure from Morrison Materials, and life had settled into a new and unexpected rhythm. At Williamson, I was thriving. My intimate knowledge of the industry had allowed me to identify opportunities for growth that others had missed. Joseph was pleased with my work, and I had already been given additional responsibilities beyond my initial role. I had also continued a limited consulting relationship with Morrison, focusing only on their most complex international contracts. Jason and I had developed a cautious professional respect, his initial arrogance tempered by the realization that experience couldn't be replaced by theory alone. As I prepared dinner, I heard a key in the lock. Liz was visiting from Boston for the weekend. She swept in, bringing the crisp autumn air and her boundless energy with her. "Mom, something smells amazing." She hugged me tightly before dropping her bag by the door. "Just pasta with grandma's sauce," I said, returning her embrace. "How was the drive?" "Not bad. I listened to that podcast you recommended about women in corporate America." She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. "It made me think of you." The host was talking about how women over 50 are often pushed out of their jobs despite being at the peak of their expertise. I stirred the sauce, thinking of that day 6 months ago when Jason had so casually dismissed me. Well, sometimes being underestimated is actually an advantage. Liz smiled. "The Sarah Bennett principle. When they think you're finished, show them you're just getting started." Later, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Liz asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you ever regret not going back to Morrison when Robert offered? It was your home for so long." I considered her question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I love that company, but sometimes you need to leave home to truly find yourself again." I gazed at the sunset, remembering the windowless office I'd occupied for so many years. At Williamson, I'm valued for my experience, not despite it. And I've rediscovered parts of myself that got lost along the way. Like having dinner with your daughter on a Friday night instead of working late? Liz teased. Exactly. I squeezed her hand. Don't get me wrong. I'm proud of what I accomplished at Morrison. But I've learned that sometimes a door closing is just the universe's way of directing you to a better one. Pretty wise for someone Jason Morrison thought was dead weight, Liz said with a smirk. I laughed. Well, his education continues. I heard from Robert last week. Apparently, Jason tried to fire 2 more senior executives and discovered they had similar clauses in their contracts. No way. What happened? Robert stepped back in temporarily as chairman of the board. Jason's still CEO, but with supervision. Liz raised her wine glass. To my brilliant mother, who taught an arrogant CEO the most expensive lesson of his career. I clinked my glass against hers. To unexpected new beginnings at any age. As the last light faded from the sky, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. At 54, when many women are told their best years are behind them, I had found new strength, new purpose, and a renewed appreciation for the wisdom that only comes with experience. Sometimes, I thought, the most powerful revenge isn't about tearing someone down. It's about rising so high they have no choice but to look up at you.